extending the real estate investment trust provisions to renewable energy facilities. These provide tax breaks and other benefits for investment in various commercial facilities. So this would be the first time that renewable energy facilities would be part of this equation. Also, DOE is expected to propose and finalize various efficiency standards for appliances and other consumer products. And there is energy efficiency legislation that came up in Congress last year, fairly limited. It would provide about $350 million in funding for various energy efficiency measures, and that will probably come up again this year. Finally, in terms of renewable fuels, EPA has proposed its renewable fuel standard for 2014. It will have to finalize it. It actually lowered the amount of renewable fuel that is required to be blended into the nation's fuel supply, because the level of fuel being produced has gone down, and we're coming up against what's called a blend wall, where there's a debate over whether if you put too much ethanol and other renewable fuels into the gasoline supply, does it affect engines for various types of vehicles. There's also efforts in Congress to address that and possibly reform the renewable fuel standard in 2014. Representative Shimkus said recently in an event that he doesn't see a lot of support yet for moving on it, but certainly will be a topic of discussion in Congress this year. Another key issue area, and certainly one that goes to the question of expanding EPA's authority under several statutes, is water. EPA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers are expected to propose a rule that would modify the definition of waters of the United States under the Clean Water Act. This could expand the scope of waters that are subject to regulation by EPA. There's a lot of, a draft rule has come out. EPA said it's not the final version, they've stressed that, but there's a lot of concern among various stakeholders of, how far would this expand EPA's authority into wetlands and other water sources in terms of the Clean Water Act. In terms of other developments on the waterfront, EPA is expected to finalize, it's under court deadline to issue final guidance in terms of limiting pollutants from power plants, effluent limitations, also in terms of setting performance standards for cooling water intake structures. They're doing that. Also, in terms of legislation, one of the few environmental-related bills that got traction last year in Congress was related to water resources, Water Resources Development Act, and that's expected to be passed this year with bipartisan support. It's now in conference. So that would provide money to various water infrastructure projects. There were a handful of bills that passed on the energy and environment front last year. There were bills to support hydropower development, some bills dealing with public lands, and this is one bill that has a good chance of being passed in 2014. In terms of chemicals and a little bit on waste, question for chemicals, is this a year that chemical reform finally passes? This has been going on for several years. Various bills have been introduced in Congress on chemical reform to reform the Toxic Substances Control Act. You have various incidents, most recently the West Virginia spill, which is spurring calls for chemical reform. But there are a lot of obstacles ahead. One of the key issues is state preemption. Now, the Toxic Substances Control Act preempts state regulation of chemicals. It hasn't really been an issue because the federal government hasn't done a lot in terms of regulating existing chemicals. A number of states have moved ahead and issued their own regulations, California being a prime example. And the question is, will this preemption continue in any reform of TSCA? Will the federal government still preempt states in terms of their ability to regulate chemicals? So that's one key issue. But it would certainly expand the authority of EPA to regulate chemicals. So that would be another area that EPA potentially has its authority expanded in the coming year. The legislative session is fairly short in terms of number of weeks in 2014, particularly before the elections coming up. And so, there's not a lot of confidence that it will actually be enacted this year, but hearings will be held. There will be more momentum on it going forward. Also, the West Virginia spill is certainly going to continue demand for more public information on chemicals. EPA, of course, is taking various, as TSCA reform is going through Congress and being debated, EPA is taking steps. It does have authority under current statute to regulate chemicals. So it's expected to take a number of steps dealing with confidential business information on chemicals, regulating chemicals and products, risk assessment, and possibly risk management for chemicals that exist, and nanomaterials in terms of regulating those. Just very briefly on waste, some key developments that we can expect in 2014 is EPA to finalize a rule on managing coal ash waste from power plants. That's another issue where there's federal state debate. Congress, or sorry, the House passed legislation last year which would give states the authority to regulate coal ash, and the Senate still has to take it up, but it's something which will be ongoing. And also EPA is due to issue a final rule revising the definition of solid waste, which would basically modify what types of waste are subject to the RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Fracking is towards the end, but it's certainly a big issue in a lot of people's minds. The Bureau of Land Management is due to issue final regulations on oil and gas exploration and production. We'll focus a lot on fracking. States and industry argue that the rule is not necessary. They already regulate public and other lands within their borders. BLM has said that if states are doing it and they're doing an adequate job, then they can continue doing it. But there'll be a lot of debate over what constitutes an adequate job, and how you transfer that authority. EPA is also close to issuing a final guidance on regulating the use of diesel fuels and fracking fluid. And finally, I've talked a number of cases, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, of the state versus federal interplay. Fracking is an example where there's also a state versus local interplay going on. A lot of court cases going on in Pennsylvania, Colorado, New York, elsewhere, in terms of do local jurisdictions have the ability to regulate fracking. In TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act talked about federal preemption of state regulations on chemicals. A lot of localities, towns, and various places are trying to limit fracking. Sometimes it's just for they don't actually have fracking going on there. It's just a statement they're making. Sometimes certainly is some substance to it. And courts are, various courts are ruling in different ways. The Pennsylvania court just ruled that local towns do have the ability to use zoning and other regulations to control fracking within their borders. So just to conclude, as in previous years, much of environmental developments in the U.S., and this obviously is focused on U.S. developments, much of it will be driven by regulation and litigation, not legislation. The administration's priorities could come into clearer view, certainly with the State of the Union speech next week and the next budget that comes out. We talk about Congress not being particularly active, being gridlocked. That being said, things can always happen. They could break through their gridlock on some key issues. Disasters can certainly spur action. If you have further spills like the one in West Virginia or other chemical accidents, it might further prompt calls for a reform of chemical laws in the U.S. As I said at the beginning, court rulings this year and the year ahead will help to further define EPA's authority to regulate the environment under various statutes. As I said, this is not new, but the push and pull of limiting or expanding EPA's authority, and also in terms of Republicans trying to reduce the budget and limit EPA spending on various things, that's going to continue in the courts, in the Congress, and elsewhere. And also the issue of state versus federal jurisdiction will certainly continue. Just wanted to briefly acknowledge my presentation benefited greatly from our environmental outlook for 2014, put together by a great team of reporters that I had the privilege of working with. Some of them include that worked on these issues in particular are Andrew Childers, Andrew Childers, Anthony Adragna, Irene Nader, Amina Saeed, Alan Koski, and Pat Rizzuto. And thank you very much.
Hi, now I'd like to invite Douglas Fisher, who will moderate our panel, to come up. Douglas is the editor of the Daily Climate, and our other panelists as well, if they'd like to come up to the stage. Also note, some of you may have heard the alarm that's going off. That's in another part of the Reagan building, which is a very large building, and I've been told it does not affect us at this time. If that changes, I will let you know, so no worries.
Thanks. You're sitting here. Yeah. Well, thank you, Larry, for that overview, and thank you all for being here. And we are blessed with a truly remarkable panel of journalists this afternoon. I did just a quick check in our archives at Environmental Health News and the Daily Climate, and I counted 315 byline stories from these 5 reporters sitting here just last year, 2013. And that's just from our small aggregating team. It only covers environmental health and climate change, coverage, and it doesn't include the contributions that Larry and Dennis made to their newsrooms shaping coverage. It just gives you a sense of the scale at which these journalists are working here. So let me briefly introduce. Coral Davenport is doing a fantastic job on the climate and energy beat at the New York Times. She joined the paper in December after writing one great story after another for the National Journal. Suzanne Goldenberg is my hero, actually. I mean, all you guys are really heroes, but Suzanne is constantly a step ahead of me on the climate beat, and it's only part of her beat as the U.S. environment correspondent for The Guardian. If I wasn't such a fan, I'd be a bitter and frustrated journalist. But she's also the author of Madam President, Hillary Clinton's historic run for the White House. Dennis Dimmock, as the executive editor of the National Geographic, Dennis has really turned that magazine into a must-read publication on environmental issues. Every year, it seems, there's a National Geographic reporter or photographer at the podium of SCJ's Environmental Journalism Awards, taking home some nice hardware. It's really impressive to watch. Cheryl Hogue is another top reporter, really a fearless reporter. She's a senior correspondent for Chemical and Engineering News. She has no fear of wading into EPA regulations of chemicals, international climate politics, or federal regulatory policy. She's also, even more fearless, a former SCJ board member. Andrew Revkin really needs no introduction. He has been on the cutting edge of journalism since before journalists even knew we could have a cutting edge. He's created the .earth blog.
Because I'm old.
He created .earth blog at the New York Times it was 2007, yes? 2007. And to look at how in the world the Earth can sustain a population of 9 billion people. And we've been following his lead more or less ever since. And he's also a senior fellow at Pace University. So let's pick up where Larry left off. And we've got a full house. We've got a overflow capacity. We'll take your question. We'll get to your questions. But let's start off briefly here, Cheryl, with that West Virginia chemical spill. How will that draw attention to or help shape chemical reform?
It could help or it could hurt. How about that is my short answer. But this reform of the Toxic Substance Control Act, or sometimes people call it the Toxic Substances Conversation Act. Sometimes I don't even think there's a conversation going on. This is something that Congress has been batting around for a few years. They got a bipartisan bill last year. But will it happen? The spill, Douglas, actually might take some energy away from it because there's legislation that's about to be introduced in the Senate for chemical tank safety and inspection. And that might be a lot easier to pass this year than actually going through and doing this Toxic Substances Control Act reform. So I think that's something to watch. Is this going to help or is this going to hurt TSCA reform, especially if Congress wants to get home and campaign? But I think there's some other chemical things on the horizon, too. Larry touched on some of them about the state laws and regulations, and this goes into another subject I call getting that chemical out of my product, whatever chemical it is, BPA or lead or whatever chemical it is that du jour that you don't want in that particular product. States are banning certain chemicals in products, and that, of course, is driving the chemical industry nuts, because if it's banned in Washington State, well, are they going to sell something separate in Washington State than they do in Nevada or New York? And that's actually what's driving TSCA reform. But TSCA reform would, of course, preempt those sorts of state things, and Larry touched on that as well, too. But the getting rid of the chemical in my product is kind of a bigger issue. California is doing a big experiment with that. They are, under their Green Chemistry Initiative, they're going to pick a few products, and they're going to ask the manufacturers of those products, can you take this particular toxic chemical out? And it's not just as easy as, oh, we'll take that chemical out and things will be better, because when you take it out, that chemical's in there to do a job. And so you need to put something else in there. So if you take the BPA out and it's BPA free, what did they put in instead? Did they put in BPS, which has a similar toxicological profile? And where did that get you? So this whole issue of assessing the alternatives of what's in your products, this is a huge and emerging issue. California's wrestling with it. EPA is wrestling with it. In fact, the head of EPA's chemical program says this is how chemical safety will be improved in the coming years. It's not through TSCA reform. It's going to be through companies deciding to pick out the most toxic parts of their products and coming up with alternatives. But that's not easy. And finally, and then there are companies that are doing the same thing. You've probably heard about Walmart and Target and Whole Foods getting rid of certain chemicals in their products. And so that's something that the chemical industry has deemed retail regulation, although I don't know how retailers can regulate. But that's kind of an emerging issue as well. And finally, and this is going to be kind of an odd little thing, it's one type of plastic, and a number of jurisdictions are getting rid of it, and that's those foam containers that you get at the carryout, your Chinese food in or whatever. New York may join a whole bunch of jurisdictions out west in banning them. You may have read about that and think, well, isn't that done, Cheryl? And no, it's not. The sanitation commissioner is going to get a lot of pressure over the next year in making a decision whether New York can actually recycle this plastic. And the chemical industry says it can be recycled and it's worthwhile. And I think whatever you see New York decide, whether it's a financially viable thing for them to do or not, recycling it and keeping this polystyrene foam, some people call it styrofoam incorrectly, this is a big issue that's likely to spread to a lot of other jurisdictions. Other big cities are looking at this as well, too.
This could be the year of the end of polystyrene. Possibly.
Maybe in New York, maybe not.
Fair enough. Let's jump around a little bit and talk about the other big issue of coal. And Coral and Suzanne, I think, where do you see what's happening with coal, both in the U.S. and we are in the Wilson Center, so let's talk about internationally. What's going on in Europe and China with coal?
Well, I guess I'll just start off very generally and think, I mean, it's true that everything, when it comes down to climate, and you could argue that everything always comes down to coal, that is, was, and always will be. But I think it's something that we will become even more conscious of this year because of developments both at home and internationally. Now, Larry touched on those things when he talked about the regulations coming in that are going to limit emissions from power plants, both new and existing. And what that has really done is focus on the issue of whether or not technologies are available and economical enough to make carbon capture and storage a reality. So I think we're going to see a lot of sort of debate about those technologies, the pricing of those technologies going forward, and that's going to shape the regulations as they make their way into the system. Only the first phase of regulating coal has been put on the Federal Register. That was in January when the new standards for the power plants of the future came out, and it's going to be even more dicey and difficult in June when the proposed standards for existing power plants come out. So I think we're going to see a lot of debate about carbon capture and storage, and can it work, how does it work, etc. We're also going to see this debate conducted at a time when the country is going into midterm elections. So this debate is not, I would say a large chunk of the debate is not going to be on the merits of carbon capture and storage, on whether or the substance of this issue. It's going to be about politics, and it's going to be down and dirty, and I would expect we'll see a lot in August about that. I was going to talk about international stuff, but maybe you want to talk about the...
Yeah, I'll jump in just a little bit more on the politics. We're absolutely going to see a revival of this idea that the administration is waging war on coal. For sure. I mean, the political operative campaigns, the Republican House and Senate campaigns are already preparing now for that June regulation, the June draft regulation on existing plants. I had one operative say, if Obamacare is our right hook in this campaign, war on coal is going to be our left hook. These EPA regs are going to be what we go after. But I think it's going to be very interesting. I think it's important to pay a lot of attention to whether that works. I think it's accurate to say that the Obama administration is waging war on coal. These regulations are about shutting down coal-fired power plants. And we saw that campaign. We saw the coal lobby and the super PACs spend tremendous amounts of money and campaign aggressively on that theme in 2012. We also saw that they failed. Obama won in all the swing states that have significant coal mining operations. It's Pennsylvania, Virginia, Colorado, and Ohio. The war on coal campaign didn't work. So I think it's interesting to see, even though this gets turned into a political campaign, if it's not effective, I think that what we're seeing the administration calculate is that it can go ahead and continue to move forward with these regulations, talk in a much more sort of forceful and aggressive way about climate change than it had before. I think in 2012, the president's political operation said, don't even talk about climate change. We're terrified of this war on coal stuff. I think after 2012, they saw, you know what? We can talk about climate change. We can be accused of waging war on coal, and we can win anyway. I think that we may see a couple of House races get hit by that. I think Nikki Jo Rahal in West Virginia, one of the only remaining Democrats in a coal state district, I think he might be vulnerable. I think he might get hit by this. But I think it will be interesting to see if they continue to spend money and they continue to push on that campaign and it doesn't work, what that does to the broader political debate, and how, if that emboldens other candidates to feel comfortable embracing these regulations or talking about climate change.
Well, do you see, pardon me for jumping in, but do you see the administration making that June kind of deadline for regulations on existing coal-fired plants? It's one thing to regulate new plants, it's kind of in the future, but existing plants, you're talking, those are jobs, that's communities.
So
do you see that slipping maybe a little bit?
Well, I don't think so, and here's why. This administration, this president, sees climate change as his legacy, and he wants to get as much done as he possibly can before he leaves, because he doesn't know what the next administration is going to do. He is being so aggressive with his schedule. It's a much tighter schedule than you usually see for these regulations. And what they are telling me at EPA is, and you never see this with regulations. Usually, EPA will work on a regulation for years and miss deadlines, and then, they'll go to the White House, they'll go to OMB, and the White House will say, this is bad timing, no regulations. And the dynamic is really different this time. It's very clear that, people have said literally the White House is nagging them and checking in and demanding progress reports. And because in order to get as much done before the president leaves in 2016, they need the draft rule for existing plants by June 1st. Then they have a year to finalize it. So that's June 1st, 2015. And then states will have 1 year to devise a plan, to submit a plan to comply with it. So that'll be done by June 2016. That's a really fast schedule. That's as much as they can possibly get done. And that just triggers sort of the rounds of lawsuits. But I think the dynamic in this is so different from what you usually see with environmental regulations, with this precedent, this White House pushing as hard as they can. I know that at EPA, they have dozens and dozens and dozens of lawyers and engineers and economists tasked with working on this. I don't say day and night, but I know they're doing, I mean, I've been told there's 5-hour sessions, 10-hour sessions. There's a lot of pressure to get this done on time.
Fair enough. Well, Suzanne, you're going to take us overseas on coal, but first, can we get Dennis in here to talk a little bit?
Can I talk about coal?
Oh, definitely. Got plenty of coal.
Okay, so I mean, I have to admit that the framework or the lens that we might look at these issues through is a bit different because, of course, there's the legislative challenges in the United States, but also the speed with which we work is pretty slow. So I will tell you that in April, released March 15, we'll have a major piece on this question: can coal ever be clean? Can it be clean? And the focus of that piece really is on this question of carbon capture and storage. It is technologically feasible, but is it economically sustainable? And the reason that we're asking that question is, I think the framework in the United States for viewing coal is a bit different than it is globally. Because in the United States, for example, up until just a few years ago, the majority of our electricity did come from coal. And it has dropped fully by 1/3 because of the rise of cheap natural gas from as we all know, fracking. But the rub here is that globally, the use of coal since the turn of the century has risen faster as a primary energy source for the global economy than virtually all other energy sources combined. The rise in the demand for the use of coal globally in the last 12 or 13 years is greater than the rise in solar, wind, oil, everything else. And so, but also the rub is it's a local energy source. We are said to be the Saudi Arabia of coal. This is a problem that's not going to go away. And if you're trying to deal with, and how are you going to limit temperature increases on the planet to less than 2 degrees centigrade, how you deal with coal is going to be one of the key questions, and we're going to try to illuminate that.
Can I just add a little bit more?
Definitely.
On the feasibility of carbon capture and storage was illustrated when I went to Illinois. I was at this Archer Daniels Midland ethanol plant they have a big stream of CO2 there that comes off their plant that's used in the biggest test in this country of this technology. And I think they got to this landmark, this was about a year ago. I was out there getting 1 million tons of CO2 in the ground. But the people who ran this off the record said they can never foresee this happening at scale, meaning a gigaton is a billion tons. And if you're not talking gigatons and world using energy the way the world is, you can forget about the idea of this being a big part of the climate solution, setting aside the cost and the infrastructural needs of doing that at any kind of scale. And then there's the reality: coal is becoming a commodity. It's not just local anymore. Australia is shipping huge amounts of coal to China, and it doesn't account for that carbon in its own. Australia theoretically has this. Well, maybe not anymore. Haven't kept track. But so that the carbon that goes to China gets burned there and comes back to Australia in goods and everywhere else is not accounted for in their cap that they try to have. So coal, and our coal is now exported increasingly both to Europe and to Asia as well. It's kind of like if you're the environmental community, you're trying to kind of stop all these flows. It's an impossible task because in many parts of the world, the primacy of cheap energy will always dominate your concerns about climate change. You can see that. I was in Beijing, talked to their lead climate strategist in October, and they need the energy. And what they want to do is clean up their urban pollution, absolutely. So they have a big push in there toward getting our natural gas now, LNG. So, and also their own fracking in the end. So it's a tough landscape.
What are you seeing, Suzanne? I mean, both in China and Europe too. I mean, Germany's, isn't it?
Right. I mean, Germany has increased its use of coal, and even though the European Union just this week set their new targets for climate change, which was to cut emissions by 40% by 2030, Germany won't reach those targets because it's increasing its use of coal. Poland gets 90% of its electricity from coal, and in China itself, one country uses as much coal as the rest of the world put together. So, despite the sort of pressures because of climate change to reduce use of coal, it is a very, very difficult problem, and it's. I think the point that people have been making is a very important one, that this is a global issue now. What happens in the U.S., even though, even though coal plants are shutting down here, globally, use of coal continues to rise.
One thing I want to mention, we talked about war on coal, but we also just talked about how U.S. is exporting coal to Asia and to Europe and approving new export terminals and so forth. So I think the argument could be made that it's not 100% war on coal. The administration is going forward and approving environmental impact statements and various other regulatory approvals for exporting coal overseas. So it's not quite black and white, saying that the administration is completely against coal. An argument could be made that there are steps that are being taken to support the coal industry, various aspects of the coal industry in the U.S., particularly in terms of exports.
That's true. I mean, okay, well, speaking of the administration and stopping flows, let's talk a little bit about Keystone. I suspect by April or possibly June, everybody in this audience is going to be tired of Keystone. But I'm wondering kind of and I'm not so interested in kind of maybe where the president might come down on this, but I'm wondering, what's the impact of a decision, yes or no, in, a year from now? Will it really matter? Will it fire up the base somehow? Does it have any sort of impact, or is this all is it the uncertainty that's driving this? Where do you guys see this one?
I mean, I think Canada is committed. I mean, the debate over Keystone is obviously a debate over the oil sands and the emissions that come out of oil sands operations. And Alberta and Canada are committed to continuing to develop the oil sands and drawing oil from them. And Keystone is the avenue they want to have in terms of bringing it to refineries on the Gulf Coast. But they're committed to continuing to develop the oil sands with or without Keystone. May make it more complicated. Might take longer to develop and get the oil out to various export destinations. But it's going to continue. So if you're looking at it from an emissions point of view, I don't really think that it's going to have that much of an impact. If Canada is still and Alberta are still going to develop the oil sands, and you're going to have those emissions coming out of those operations, whether it comes by Keystone, by pipeline, whether it goes by rail, whether the oil goes out west to Vancouver and is shipped over to Asia, in tankers, it's going to come out most likely. I think they're determined to accrue the economic and other benefits that they see from developing the oil sands.
I think, though, that every day, as it stands now, Canada doesn't have the swift exit routes to markets that it wants. It doesn't have the Gateway Pipeline built. It doesn't have Keystone built. It's falling back on oil by rail, and as are other producers, which, as we've seen with the accidents at Lac Mégantic in Quebec, which killed 47 people and destroyed half the town last summer, and other accidents here in the U.S., oil by rail is not a great solution. And I think if you look at this on a day-to-day basis, every day that the oil stays in the ground is another day that the oil stays in the ground. And I think for the environmental movement, that is a small victory. That the delay. I think that in itself has been a victory for the environmental movement. I mean, this project was seen as a slam dunk when it came forward, and look how long they've managed to drag it out. And the circumstances are changing for that product, and energy prices are dropping for that product, and natural gas has come online. So in some ways, they've won this sort of very series of small incremental victories in the hope that the energy landscape and climate change landscape will change in the long term.
But do you think it'll continue to be it's become a political issue, right? It's become in some ways a proxy for, on one side for the climate, on the other side for jobs and energy independence. Will it still play that role once there's a decision made, or will it kind of fade off and we'll be dealing with fracking or water or California's drought or whatnot?
I think it's always been an imperfect proxy, both as a mobilizing tool and as a, just in terms of, I think it's been an imperfect proxy. It was created, the issue was of the Keystone Pipeline was a good issue in terms of framing the debate about climate change in a way that people could understand. Oh, look, a pipeline, and they did mobilize and get lots of people to court arrest, to go to protests at the White House to resist it. But is this the single most thing that, is this pipeline the one thing that will destroy the planet? I mean, can that be scientifically established? That's just not true. So I'm not sure what the sort of ramifications of a sort of decision are going to be. And I think the arguments pro in terms of jobs, I don't know those aren't true either, and I don't know how convincing they are.
There's a third consideration for Obama, which is international relations. He wants to maintain good relations with Canada. He'd rather have oil from Canada coming here than have to rely on oil from countries that we're not friendly with. So there is another factor in the national interest question that makes it complex. It's not just local politics.
I've also had international negotiators say that as the negotiations move towards some kind of climate pact in 2015, the big thing that the rest of the world is looking at is whether Obama is going to move forward on these EPA regulations. Right. But they do say, I've had negotiators say, we are going to look at the Keystone decision is something that we're going to take, it's going to send a strong signal. It's going to, they see it as a symbol and a signal, but it's going to have an impact on the strength of the negotiators' hands when they go into these talks. I think the real thing is, that the U.S. will be doing the power plant regs. But I mean, I think that there are international negotiators who say this is going to tell us something about, are you negotiating in good faith? How serious are you about this? This is just a symbolic thing that you can do, but it's important. So I mean, I hear international negotiators saying that they're looking at it for that reason.
Just in terms of a longer time frame, this issue is Canada is the leading foreign supplier of oil to the United States now, and the longer that we are connected to this, the longer we're going to be. And I think the one interesting observation about the whole thing is we're talking about long-term infrastructure. And when you make commitments to building these kinds of things, that means you've made a choice for the long term. When you build pipelines, when you build coal plants, when you do all this, that means you've made huge capital investments for decades. And that sets an energy path for you. And if you're already in this situation where you understand that rising carbon emissions are going to have an adverse effect on, say, the stability of your climate, what it's doing is, in one sense, as you tie yourself more to oil or other carbon sources, you're actually then foreclosing or precluding choices that you might have made otherwise in investing in other kinds of non-carbon emission energy. That, to me, is where the real rub gets.
Very good point there. And speaking of long-term choices, let's talk, Dennis, a little bit about water. And where California stuck in a historic drought. We're losing rivers in China. Where do you see water issues going this year? What are the choices that are
that's huge. I actually did a little survey work before I came here, so I wasn't just sitting here prognosticating. I talked to Peter Glick at the Pacific Institute and several other journalists, and I think the thing to keep in mind is that as there's rising pressure on water supplies, you have competing demands, and there's this sort of energy, food, water nexus that occurs, and we're seeing it in the energy landscape. When you look across the Great Plains or North Dakota and Texas, they're drilling for oil in arid regions, and there's, say, for example, in Texas, there's very little surface water, so you're mining fossil water that's going to run out eventually from the Ogallala Aquifer to get cheap energy. And that may help you in the near term, but you're setting up the program for essentially desertification and essentially abandonment in future decades. I think, at least in the United States, I think an emergent thing, and is yes, of course, we're aware that there is a paltry snowpack in California and southern Oregon, and that is actually worrisome. But at the same time, I am from Oregon, so I understand that late winter storms can have an impact. But what is interesting, though, is not just California; it's all of the West. And there have been long-term studies that have shown decline in snowpack over 50 years, over the Rockies, over the Cascades and the Sierras, and it's all tied to this warming and drying. I think one thing, though, as far as, and so what you have is this sort of like for the last 100 years, the Bureau of Reclamation essentially created this sleight of hand where we build all these dams in the West to capture snowmelt off of mountains from the storms that came in. And now that provided the buffer zone to give you water late in the summer and before the winter storms came. But now we're seeing sort of a long-term continuous decline in the volume and the water content of these snowstorms. Yet at the same time, we have big population increases. California is sort of like the salad bowl of America. We have all these demands for these resources. And I think that one thing that is interesting, at least, is in the West right now, this situation where this sort of sleight of hand with dams and water storage is like maybe the clock is running out on it, is we also need to not just look at agriculture and cities and sort of the urban human landscape. I think that one thing that needs to be addressed and is not necessarily being included in the narrative right now is the matter of damaged ecosystems. Because when you start talking about in-stream flows, salmon runs, forests, I mean, it's shocking to look at the GRACE has, NOAA has the GRACE satellite soil moisture maps, and if you look at Western California, the deficit of soil moisture is tremendous, and that shows you where you are. As far as I got a note from my brother who lives in Southern Oregon this morning, and he said someplace in the Southern Cascades of Oregon where he goes, deer hunting is on fire right now.
Yeah, if you're a reporter, I mean, that GRACE data from that satellite is on soil moisture is this astounding picture for a local story or a regional story.
By the way, in terms of journalism covering this stuff, we operate on timescales that miss some of the big picture too. And Dennis has hinted at this with basically the 100-year development of the West happened in an unusually wet era. Right. That the 20th century was really weirdly wet, looking back through the history of the West. So all that growth, all that development, all that agricultural industrialization took place in a time that was not artificially, but unusually wet. And now, setting aside the complicated question about what happens with greenhouse forcing on the climate system, the norm out there is not going to sustain the level of development that we've had. So that's, but it's hard to write a story about on those time scales. Hey, go to your newsroom and try to sell that. You can do it at National Geographic, but not necessarily at a...
It's that old thing you said, you can't do a page one story on something that oozes, right?
Right, basically, yeah.
Well, what do you see in terms of sustainability? Where is that going to go as a story this year? Or is it?
Well, it's a hard story to tell. One reason I blog, I started the blog at the New York Times to explore these questions that don't fit into our normal news cycle. How do you head toward 9 billion people with the fewest regrets is not a news story. It's an ongoing question, and anyone who says that there's a single answer is not being truthful. So the only form, to me, of journalism that really captures that well is an ongoing conversation, which is a blog. And I'm not saying that there's no value in printed paper and all that stuff, but for some of these bigger questions, it's better I think it's better to have that kind of exploration of it.
The slow ooze and the ongoing...
Well, slow drips, I call them. Slow drips, and, right. It's a world of slow drips that set up hard knocks. And you see this all over the world. Just give you one example from the Philippines, a big typhoon. It got a lot of attention, even the climate, is this global warming? what was largely missed there in conventional coverage and discourse was that the population of that city that was hit tripled in the last 40 years. If that storm had hit that same city, same storm, same city 40 years ago would not have been a story, essentially. Would have been, and when you look at maps of past typhoon traffic in that part of the Pacific, that part of the Philippines is like ground zero. There's a paper, there was an academic paper that had this map. So what's happened, the fast-paced thing has been demographic change, and not just population growth, meaning, you know, from 6 to 9 billion people in my lifetime, in my adult lifetime. It's agglomerations, urbanization in hazard zones and stuff. So that's a big chunk of the sustainability question is those kinds of clashes. And then you add the climate question on top of that, it becomes more complicated. But too often we've been saying, oh, this is global warming because there was some dramatic event, when the losses, the extent of the losses, wildfires in Colorado, the wildfires east of Austin, Texas 2 years earlier, Moore, Oklahoma, tripled population in the last 40 years in Moore, Oklahoma. And there was, where that horrible tornado had such a big loss. And those people moved in not really being cognizant of what a tornado, a lot of the people there were newcomers, or at least had not built the homes were not built to a standard to survive, even to have a little shelter to survive a storm. So these changes, it's not all about environmental change, it's about our change. And that means there's some plasticity there too, that with policy you can get at some of these things. I would like to see, like one of the stories of this year that I would like to see written, but that's hard to write, is about these pernicious incentives that we built into our system in America that facilitate people building in harm's way. And you see right now in Congress, there's pressure on Congress in an election year to cut back. Oh, the cost of insurance went up. Yeah, right, it's because it's a high risk. But no, the pressure in Congress is to cut back on the cost of the insurance. And then again, just in Colorado, the red zone in Colorado, the place where on maps you see where the fire zones are, we still allow federal deduction on a second home, second mortgage, to build a house in some place like that. That's us, taxpayers, who pay for people building in areas that we know federally funded firefighters are going to have to come and put out the fire. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to work on. But they're not sort of the simple story.
Yeah, definitely not simple. Before we go to audience questions, I'm just going to take a moderator's prerogative and ask a totally off-the-wall question. Lady Gaga and Jay-Z. Is this the year pop culture, do you think, is going to get involved in environmental issues?
Well, it is in China, in a big way.
Really?
But not them.
Not them, right,
No, but Yao Ming, I've written several pieces about how the tide seems to have turned on shark fins, not yet on ivory, but on shark fin consumption because of celebrities have driven a campaign that started in 2005 with some careful surveys of the Chinese public. And the shorthand word in Chinese for shark fin soup doesn't include the word shark. They found that out. Oh, whoa, that's interesting. You know, and then they built a campaign around it, and now the government has tipped. The government did not lead the way, but because of social pressures, the government is saying we're not going to serve shark fins at state dinners anymore. So it's a big deal.
Wow. Do you think it could happen here in the U.S. or in the UK? Or, no?
Not like that.
Yeah, not in as, but on smaller issues. I mean, I think climate change is too big an issue, and there's already a lot of celebrities involved.
Sure,
right?
Keystone,
but I
we
think
have some
it's
folks getting involved.
Yeah,
Keystone, we have some folks. You have
Fracking.
Neil Young.
There have been
Actually,
a lot.
fracking,
Yeah,
you're
I was
right.
going to say, actually,
Mark Ruffalo.
there have been, not just Mark Ruffalo, there's been a lot of celebrities getting involved in fracking. I think because they live in New York and they are afraid, they're afraid that the fracking is going to affect the water supply in the Catskills.
That is true.
Yeah, so that's one where Yoko Ono got
Yoko
involved,
Ono.
and they took out a big ad in the Times. There still isn't fracking in New York State.
And chemicals as well too. I understand that Leonardo DiCaprio has a movie on chemicals.
And you do. Then you have the Showtime thing where you're going to have Schwarzenegger, and you know, there's that whole big. So celebrities are involved, you know, in different environmental issues for sure. I don't know if there's any I would single out as the sort of climate champion.
Fair enough. We have got two lovely people with microphones, I believe, on the side for questions. So we'll open up. I just ask you that we are being webcast. And so if you could speak into the microphone for your question. No diatribes, no rants, no speeches, please. Have a question And because I know that a bunch of you guys have questions, we'd like to get to as many as possible. We will be taking, there'll be somebody circulating note cards in the overflow room, and I'll get those somehow, so we'll definitely take some questions from the overflow. And let's go with the first question. The gentleman sitting right in the back, is that Mr. Mazzano?
Frank. Hi, Frank Mazzano, Bracewell Giuliani. Know many of you, thank you for doing this. The president's getting some flack from our friends in the Enviro community over all of the above, and we've had some ping-ponging back and forth lately over that. What's your thoughts on that? And is this the typical banter back and forth, or is there some serious consternation on the Enviro side about the positions he's taking in your mind?
I think this is what Enviros do. I mean, I think I didn't think it was a big deal. I think it's typical back and forth. The administration is moving. I think they're moving forward pretty seriously on their power plant regs. I think they recognize that, cheap natural gas is going to help them move forward on those regs. The environmental community doesn't like that. It's the environmental community to always push, always agitate. That's what they do. I don't see this.
I thought, for me, what was more interesting was John Podesta's comeback at them, which was pretty sharply worded. I mean, the environmental community has been criticizing the White House quite a lot, and on the Keystone, and trying to sort of mobilize capital in that. Big donors have tried to apply pressure and shown how important the issue is to them, and that's what happened. I thought the sort of sharply worded rebuke from John Podesta stood out for me because the White House tries to finesse those things generally, and he was basically saying, we're doing everything that we can. Why would you question us when we're already besieged? Back off. And I don't remember a comeback from the White House that strong. It's also interesting that when John Podesta came on board for this sort of quite recently at the White House, it was thought that he would be the advisor who was pushing Obama on climate, to do more on climate, to get the EPA regs in place. There was speculation that he could help kill the Keystone Pipeline. Now, it not only turns out that John Podesta is going to be preoccupied with NSA, but he sort of offered that sort of sharp comeback to the environmental community.
The president hasn't done himself any favors in the way he's talked about natural gas, because one of the ways he could disarm some of these criticisms is to say all of the above plus, and he hasn't really done that in terms of like the EPA plan to require green completions, more careful practices. I wish he would. I'm actually an opinion writer as of 3 years ago, so I can kind of say stuff like this. But I've written it that he really lost an opportunity to not just say, oh, wow, cool, natural gas, we need more of it, as opposed to saying we need to do it really carefully and to make sure that the EPA has a fast track on whichever regulations it can fast track, and he hasn't really done that.
Let's take another question. How about the sir or the woman in the back?
Thank you. I have actually two questions. The first question is with the American momentum to export coal to Asia, and do you think San Francisco and Seattle will be, more will relax their transportation in terms of shipping coal to China? That's the first question. And second question, actually, yesterday the Bloomberg News just released a report on Sinopec discovering shale gas in having the intention to develop shale gas to frack Sichuan, south of China. So do you think it's such a bold move, considering that the technological barrier to frack the southern China is more, challenging than here in the States or Canada? Thank you.
I can take the first one on exporting coal. A story that I thought was really interesting in 2012 was the fight over it was actually a county council race in Bellingham County, Washington, where there is a proposed coal export terminal, the Gateway Terminal, which if built would be the largest coal export terminal in the country. And it was very interesting to see Enviro groups, Tom Steyer's group, League of Conservation Voters, and the coal industry ended up putting $1 million total into this county council race, because the county councilors will end up permitting that coal export terminal. The Enviros won. All of the county councilors who ended up getting elected were progressive Democrats, and it now looks like they're not going to permit that coal terminal. And, you know, people look at that and they say, you know, the Enviros claimed a huge victory there, and they do intend to weigh in wherever they can in local politics on the West Coast that can influence whether or not these coal export terminals get built. And when I talk to people about this, they say, you know, these coal export terminals are the local population and the local politicians are going to have a huge influence on whether they get built. So these are the local populaces of San Francisco, Portland, Seattle. You know, to me, that makes it that signals that they're a lot less likely to get built. If you have those local politics on the ground, plus outside green groups prepare to invest heavily wherever they can to keep those export terminals from getting built. I mean, right now, the sense that I have from both sides is that it's going to be an uphill battle.
Just very quickly on the fracking in China. I interviewed the top China climate strategist in Beijing in October, and he seemed way more interested in U.S. LNG than in the reality that China can develop its own gas resource in the next 10 years or so. So it's more a function of imports. They're looking for Russian gas as well. It would be a great opportunity for the U.S. to partner with China because we have the expertise. They have the gas, but realistically, they seem to be all about LNG right now. At least that was my impression.
Well, I mean, now that you say that, maybe I'll just change my answer. My thought was that, you know, China could look at the U.S. and look at, certainly there's risk and opposition to fracking, various negatives that people see in terms of risk to drinking water, other things, seismic activity and so forth. But you can also look on the other side and see there have been a lot of benefits from fracking and from the expansion of natural gas and how it's benefited the manufacturing sector in the U.S. So you have China, which has a lot of coal use, has a lot of air pollution problems, will certainly want to increase their gas use. Now, they could import LNG from the U.S. They could also potentially develop their own reserves more. So I certainly think there will be an emphasis either maybe more on importing from the U.S., but they'll certainly explore, as Europe and other places are doing, their shale gas reserves and trying to tap those.
That, to me, that's really, when you talk about places like Europe, look, fracking is one of the most transformational technologies that has been found in a long time, that is allowing oil fields that have played out to be reintroduced online. It's allowing us to get at natural gas that otherwise wasn't there. I think for me, the thing that is most interesting and challenging is it has the potential of going everywhere. So where does it intersect? You know, we hear about methane emissions and that, but I think one of the more interesting things, especially when you're dealing more and more with sort of constrained water supplies, what impact on available water supplies, what impact on groundwater. Long-term, those to me become the bigger questions as we continue to rely more and more on this, which in one regard is a rather amazing technology. And
what you do with the waste. I mean, to me, that's a huge issue, the huge volume of fracking waste that is created, and that if it can't be pumped underground, has to be stored, and if it is stored, it has to be monitored.
And the water used once, that's it?
Fracking is forever from that point of view. But yeah, so that the fracking waste and the supply, perhaps more so, as much as the quality of water.
Yeah. Let's take a question from the overflow room. You've talked a lot about air, water, and climate. What about land? Our federally managed lands are in the spotlight lately with oil and gas reforms, Congress failing to act to move the wilderness bills, etc. What do you see as the stories of 2014? Anybody could take it.
Well,
do you think, I mean, well, do you think we'll see I mean, maybe we could rephrase that. You know, fracking is a huge issue, right? And we've talked a lot about that. But what about wilderness? What about protection? Do you see, have those battles, are those going to just fall off the table as we deal with chemical reform or Keystone or, you know, the elections? Are we not going to get a wilderness bill out of Congress?
I do think that in the last couple of years, we have seen the administration move to declare a lot of wilderness land in the West. And to declare monuments in the West in a way that has really inflamed Republicans who see it as, you know, blocking off land that could be used for resources. So I mean, every time it's about more than just protecting resources, and every time they do that, it further inflames this idea of fighting over land and resources in the West. And I think this is a tool that the president has that he does. I mean, this is kind of part of the broader story of using every tool in his executive arsenal to move his environmental agenda. And so he's been doing that over the last couple of years. I see no reason why he probably wouldn't try to do that even more, lock down more protected land before he left.
Fair enough. Let's take another question. How about up front? You, sir, in the blue sweater.
Hi, thanks. I read in October 2013 in Stratfor, a private intelligence firm, that China is considering a cap on domestic coal consumption of 4 billion tons a year. They're at 3.8 billion tons a year now. If that cap goes in, there's no market for that U.S. coal to be exported from the West Coast. What does anybody hear about this? What do you think about it?
I wouldn't say that necessarily translates into no market for imported coal, because in China it's all about coal proximity to where they need the coal, and most of their domestic coal is way out in the West. So it doesn't necessarily mean an end to imports. It's certainly not from Australia. As far as the U.S. is a different question. Yeah.
Sorry, the same report mentioned that the coal reserve development in Xinjiang potential is another 600 million tons a year by 2020. So there would be no market for U.S. coal exports from the west coast of the United States.
So it's designed to do that then, right?
One thing about the scale of use in China, which actually surprised me when we were putting this story together, is that China imports about 5% of its coal. That 5% is 3 times larger than all the rest of the world coal trade combined.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking with the China's lead negotiator at the climate talks, and he was their position throughout these climate talks has been adamant that they need the emission space to grow. You know, they look at the lovely standard of living in the U.S. and Europe, and they want their population to be there, and they have never wavered from that the point that they need to. They're not going to grow unconstrained like we did. They will grow, put limits on it, but they want to grow, and so I just wonder how that's going to. You know, how do you do that? To me, the answer is with coal.
But it's like we've met the enemy, and the enemy is us. If you look at, so what are those carbon emissions coming from? It's like 1/5 of them are for the creation of product that gets sent to the U.S.
Our goods, yes.
I think that also the idea that this is a big infrastructure investment, really, you know, China is building a lot of coal plants, and they're going to be online for decades.
Another question. How about the woman with the glasses and the blue shirt in the back?
Hi, my name is Jacqueline. I'm with the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. And Andy, you touched on population a little bit, and I'm wondering if we can expect to see stories linking growing population and, just as importantly, growing consumption as the driving force between climate change and all these other environmental problems.
Well, consumption still trumps population in terms of, you know, if you had 9 billion vegan monks, it would be a very different picture than the world we're actually going to have, and I don't think we're going to end up with the former. So consumption is the key question. Population, I think it's less appreciated that in the Paul Ehrlich days, it was seen as a global population bomb that was going to cause mass famine and all kinds of problems. And what the reality that's played out is it's more like a cluster bomb, in the sense that there are little pockets of both high fertility and just urbanization of poor people that end up with lots of problems happening in those places. So and of course the world is full of imploders as well as exploders right now, and that's the whole issue right now. What can you do to mediate, or you can't really manage it. This idea of having a global governance approach is not going to work. But fertility, getting at fertility rates in places with high fertility rates that are vulnerable to all kinds of disease and hazards is certainly a sensible option. It never gets mentioned in any of the big climate talks still. I did a piece in, I can't remember which round, where China gave a speech, and they said, we deserve credit for the 400 million Chinese who don't exist because we have a one-child policy. And that was the only speech that even mentioned the word population. And that was the end of it, so it's an issue.
I think the gentleman in the blazer and the blue blazer in the middle.
Hi, thank you. Continuing on this global conversation that we're having here, you hear a lot about the population explosion, pending population explosion is going to happen, the lack of natural resources and the conservation issues that we need to face. I'm curious to hear from all of you, predominantly Larry and Susan, in regard to the global, the top wealthiest countries. What should be some of their issues that they should be focusing on, and Andrew too, sorry, they should be focusing on this year in regard to conservation issues and environmental issues?
I mean, this is the one thing about climate change, is that the effects are going to be global, and they will be felt first, probably in the poorest countries, and yet, the perpetrators is a relatively small number of countries. And the sort of efforts to sort of reduce emissions, and I mean, the tragic thing is that it's a relatively small group of countries that are responsible for the majority of emissions, and that they process the biggest game in town for sort of trying to deal with all of this involves 196, 197 countries at the UN process. So you have this disconnect where you're trying to involve every single country, because everybody will be affected by climate change. To get to a scenario where you limit the emissions from a relatively small group of people, and what we've seen is that what we have seen is the dysfunction in that system. Trying to get agreements through that system, and unfortunately, it remains that is one of the main vehicles for trying to get action on emissions on a global level. I mean, what I hope we see and begin to see is more of these sort of bilateral agreements that we've seen, such as between the U.S. and China on HFCs, which are used in air conditioning and refrigerators, and are, in the short term, have a very big impact on the climate. And that, maybe through these sort of little side deals that you're seeing, these side negotiations between the U.S. and China, the U.S. and India, that you will see sort of more actions there. You are beginning to see in countries like Brazil and Indonesia, pretty significant efforts that have been underway on preventing the loss of forests, and so that to sort of try and protect forests, protect those carbon sinks. So I'm hopeful that you will see some small actions there, but it's if you're asking me, do I think that these sort of handful of big polluters are going to get together and sort of single-handedly say we're going to take a 50% cut in emissions by 2030? Well, that's not going to happen.
And I would argue that certainly climate change is a global issue, but in terms of, I talked in my overview in the U.S. about cross-border pollution, interstate air pollution for sulfur dioxide, other air pollutants, and certainly that's an international issue as well. There's pollutants that travel across the ocean. There was a study recently about a significant portion of pollutants in the U.S. coming from China, pollution in China. So it's a global issue as well. There's less of a talk in terms of a global deal the way there is with a climate deal that they're working towards in 2015. But certainly in terms of health impacts, direct, air pollutant emissions have a much more direct impact now on the health and welfare of populations in Asia, here, and elsewhere So I think addressing that, as countries are trying to do, is also very important in terms of a global context and improving health and welfare of the population around the world.
Let me follow that up with a question from the overflow room. Earlier this week, Tom Friedman of the New York Times wrote a column on the impact of climate change in Syria. How pervasive is the understanding of climate impacts among State Department and Department of Defense officials, and how might that be expanded?
I think in this State Department, there's a clear and growing understanding, and I think that's very driven by Secretary of State John Kerry, who has made climate a signature issue for 20 years, more than 20 years. He was at the first climate talks in Rio in 1992. And I mean, right now at the State Department, the message from the Secretary's office is very clear. Everything is focused on climate. There's an understanding, all of these offices have first of all been told, make climate change a part of every international discussion you're having, understand the role that climate plays, in global drought, in how that contributes to national security, global disruptive situations. I think that in this State Department, that message is being broadcast from the Secretary's office all the way through loud and clear. I think in the Defense Department, it's recognized as well. I mean, I think generally within the national security community, certainly on the President's national security staff, Dennis McDonough, who used to be, on his national security staff, now his chief of staff, thinks and talks about climate change as a national security issue. I would say that the awareness is there, and there are certain there are senior officials who really push that awareness, and that it's growing.
The U.S. military has been aware about the effects of climate change and how this affects national security for decades. I remember them talking about this back at the Earth Summit in 1992.
But I got to push back a little bit in terms of the overselling of climate change, which the administration and Europe have been very quick to do in situations like this. The climatology of that part of the Middle East is complicated, and there's also been a lot of water withdrawal and fights over river flows. I did a piece when there was the new satellite data from there recently. It's not, you can't say, oh, that's the specter of greenhouse-driven global warming, and that's why it's relevant. It's because of water mismanagement. It's because of long history of drought in that region. This could be just as normal as the drought in California. And I'll just give you a quick snippet from a World Bank report on uncertainty and climate investment. Just a few months ago, David Roberts at GRIST drew some good attention to it before he went on his break. There are two different models that show you sub-Saharan Africa in 2080. One is green and one is sort of parched tan. So two different world-class models have different outcomes under a global warming world in one of the most populous, poor places on the planet. So I just want to be sure. Too often in the diplomacy realm, especially, everyone wants to get these facts considered under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is only about greenhouse-driven global warming. And they kind of don't want to talk about governments mismanaging water, or just the fact that there's too much water withdrawal, or they're fighting over rivers, or there's actually a long history of drought in some of these areas.
That's all very true. I wanted to bring in an entirely different point, which is to say that the fact that the military is very concerned and focused on climate change and that it views it as a national security threat has also triggered a whole lot of decisions within the various branches of the military. And what this means is that you've seen a big effort, not only because of climate change, but because of money and security, to reduce consumption of oil within the military. And that's going to have a big effect, or may have a big effect further on, in terms of bringing up to commercial scale development of new fuels or biofuels, things like that. But there is great pressure on individual commanders and base commanders throughout the military to sort of green their establishments. I mean, there are wind turbines in Guantanamo, for example. They're putting green technology all the way through.
They don't talk about it as green, though. I mean, it's not an environmental concern. It's very much it's a security issue to not be dependent on oil, because we don't want to, have troops and contractors dying in oil convoys. But I mean, in the military, there's a new national energy, newish national security energy strategy, Pentagon-wide, to move off fossil fuels, not as an environmental issue, but very specifically to not be dependent on oil. But not as a broad security strategic move. But
So-
I'll be the first to tell you, not environmentally driven.
So I'm going to go back then to the original example that you cited from Friedman, and it dealt with, was it food?
He was talking climate impacts in
Okay,
Syria.
so
it is food, yeah.
and so if you look back, was it to Tunisia? The catalyst for the disruption was it the price of food?
Bread.
In 2008, in Mexico, the riots were over the price of corn, and that's all as a direct downstream result of, was there rain? Could the crops be harvested? Was the harvest that came off the land available at an affordable price? And so that actually, I think, when you look beyond sort of military and this question of national security, not just us, but other nations, this kind of thing is, I think it's an interesting question when you have countries in the Middle East that have lots of money, but they don't have water, and so they're in the business of, say, for example, trying to buy up land or long-term leases on land in other continents so that they can secure a future food supply. And for example, I was talking to Jerry Glover, who some of you may know. He's at USAID, and he was at the Land Institute in Kansas for years, and he's trying to build sustainable farming systems for poor farmers in Africa. And it really is being driven by this need to respond to changes in weather, which, if you want to call it climate over the long term, fine, but there's an increased frequency of extreme events, wet, dry, the kinds of things. I was a farm kid. You needed reliable rain at the right time for it to work, and so you have increased volatility. And he was talking about the fact that there's two things that are quite interesting now in trying to, as they say, what is it you're trying to build resilience in? And one of them is, and we're actually already seeing it, when SEJ was in Texas 2 years ago, there was a recognition and acknowledgement that they couldn't grow corn in the southern high plains anymore because they didn't have enough water. So they were going to have to move to sorghum millet because it was less water intensive. We're seeing these kinds of things, and that's what he said, to think that we can make sub-Saharan Africa self-sufficient in agriculture is going to require us to actually to think about whole new farming systems than the ones we have. And one of the interesting things is that there's a huge push now towards the perennialization of cereal grains, which is not 10,000 years ago. We bred annuals, and it requires machinery and energy and all that over landscapes, and the lands are often empty 40% of the time. Perennial cereal grains, all of a sudden you're keeping soil in place, you're reducing, you're improving water holding. Those are the kinds of things that I think when you start thinking about national security and climate, it's also how do you figure out ways to build margins into your system.
How about a question with the gentleman in the gold tie?
Hello, my name is Danny Richter. I'm with Citizens Climate Lobby, and I'm curious about the intersection between business and climate. There are a couple of stories by Coral in December about 29 businesses that are using an internal carbon price, and then today about Coke, and they're wanting to, the impact of drought on this. And it seems to me like this is, if it's not new for businesses, it's new for the rest of the world, and especially congressmen. And there does seem to be an emphasis on a carbon tax, which of course our group likes. But I'm curious to what your thoughts on how might this new emphasis or awareness of business caring about climate, how might that affect the psychology of your average Republican congressman?
That will be really interesting to see. One business that I'm going to be keeping a close eye on is Monsanto, which is another one of these companies that is seeing, volatility. That is, in a lot of red districts, and has also talked about seeing volatility. You know, anyone who works with agriculture in any way is pretty open about experiencing volatility, unpredictability, changes in weather. So I think that, you know, a lot of these companies are very closely affiliated with the Republican Party, are major donors. ExxonMobil is another really interesting one. They are very open about acknowledging you know, carbon emissions cause climate change. They're on the same page as the IPCC with the science. They're incorporating a price on carbon. They've proposed a possible carbon tax swap should the day ever come. They're always clear to say, they said they're not lobbying for it now, but should the day ever come, it looks like a carbon tax will be on the table. ExxonMobil has their own proposal. They're a major contributor to Republican lawmakers, and they've been comfortable saying we're going to be in a different place from these lawmakers. So I think that that's where, if there's going to be a shift in the Republican Party, I think it's going to be when their corporate friends and donors say, well, this is where we are on this.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that, you know, ExxonMobil until I think 2007, 2008 was one of the big funders of the climate change denial movement, and
until they bought XTO. No, it wasn't under pressure. It was when they bought XTO and became the largest natural gas producer in the U.S. and then became poised to profit.
Right. But they now no longer contribute to that, and yet Republican sort of beliefs on climate change continue to, you know, oppose the science. So.
I think this is. I think
we see a clear break here between corporations and the sort of Republicans in Congress, and it seems that there's a lot of ideological forces that come into play as well, not just business groups.
Although it gets pretty weird. On the way down here, I was reading the Wall Street Journal, a great article about Google's spending in Washington. And Google's given hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Competitive Enterprise Institute, separate from what they did with the Inhofe fundraising party, even as they're also a major funder of Center for American Progress. Podesta's old team gets really ugly really quickly on that stuff.
And I think there's a sense in Congress that there are Republicans that support action on climate change. And as more and more businesses address it and either adopt internal carbon pricing policies or other mechanisms to deal with climate change, that will give political cover to Republicans who do support action to come out in favor of it. So it's going to be a slow process, obviously. You have Republicans like Inhofe and other places who are probably just going to be forever against anything on climate change. And certainly coal-heavy states will be against regulating power plants and so forth. But there are a lot of other industries that are impacted now by climate events and will be in the future. And I think as more and more businesses realize that and take action on it, put pressure on through lobbying and through other means, put pressure on Democrats and Republicans in Congress, the chances for action will increase more and more.
Mark asked the gentleman in the tweed coat in the middle of the second row.
Yes. Watch out.
I'm Mark Schlefstein with the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, and so I have to ask about BP. It's been 4 years since the BP oil spill, and now we're at a point where there's already between $4 and $5 billion that have been thrown off from fines and natural resource damage assessment early payment. There's a chance for another $10 to $20 billion being poured in to create what I would suggest to you is the greatest environmental restoration experiment in the world along the Gulf Coast. What should you guys be doing to cover that? What kinds of stories should you be looking at, and who's going to be watching over all of these individual states and organizations that will be overseeing all this money that's pouring in?
I'm kind of hoping you will, yeah.
What's it look like on the ground, Mark? I mean, I mean, that's kind of one of my that's one of my main forms of currency. We have to point cameras at something that shows change.
Well, one of the bigger fights that is in the midst of popping up is some of the money that's coming in rather early is going through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to the state of Louisiana, and they're using it to start the process of building a major freshwater diversion, water from the Mississippi River that would largely be used to move sediment in to rebuild wetlands. Well, the fishermen are extremely upset about this because they contend that because it will disrupt traditional fisheries that have built up in that area as the wetlands have disappeared and moved farther and farther inland. So that's one of the key issues.
Any comments? Let's go into the back. How about there's a woman in a red sweater, third row from the back. Wait for the microphone.
Hi, my name is Dominique. I'm with Oceana, and my question is actually serendipitous to the last question. I'm curious, Oceana obviously has an opinion about the value of the world to oceans and the coverage that we get on how important the oceans related to the environment are. But I'm curious to hear from you what you think are going to be the most interesting stories or what you think are the most compelling stories for the next 2 years on the ocean.
One word, plastics.
I think ocean acidification is a really interesting story. This is another one of those stories where it's very interesting to watch what Republicans are saying. Ocean acidification in the Northwest is becoming more and more evident, and I saw some great reporting in the Seattle Times about how the Republican legislature in Alaska is taking a look at this. They're already having problems with their salmon, and the president of the Republican legislature said, I don't know about this climate change, but it's obvious that carbon is going into the ocean and we need to do something about it. What's interesting about ocean acidification is it's one of these concrete problems, concrete changes that people are paying attention to and that are having effects on, having economic effects right now. And I think that, again, I think that's a place where you start to move the needle on recognition of recognition of climate change, recognition of CO2, the need to do something about it. So I think that's an interesting story.
Jane Lubchenco called ocean acidification global warming's evil twin. And I think it's this situation is where the rubber hits the road when you start talking about, say, oh, well, we'll just put sulfates in the atmosphere to cool the planet. That, oh, we can solve this problem of global warming, but we'll just block the sun like when the volcanoes blow up. And those kinds of geoengineering schemes are being discussed. But if you're contemplating that, then at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're writing off the ocean as an acid bath, because the carbonic acid is going to continue to grow in the ocean as long as you keep burning fossil fuels.
And I think continuing on the sort of theme of climate change and oceans, certainly a huge issue that's coming up now and will come up even more in the future is in the Arctic Ocean and the melting of polar ice. And even now, there's shipping that is able to go through that wasn't able to go through, a decade ago or so. And you're going to see more and more economic activity and development of the Arctic region. That's becoming discussed more and more amongst Canada, Russia, U.S., Nordic countries, in terms of how will that affect the environment as you have more and more activity in the Arctic area as polar ice recedes. And that will be a big issue in the coming years.
Yeah, one ocean issue that spills onto the land is that I think is badly undercovered is the wearing blender of biology, how we've mashed up global biology. Lionfish are spreading up the Gulf Coast. They'll be off Long Island. They dominate a reef wherever they go. The Asian carp moving into the Great Lakes. The idea that we're going to keep them out is just so silly to me. That we've set in motion in the Anthropocene, this age of man, untold changes in the biology of the planet that are really fascinating. And the Arctic warming, a gray whale, a Pacific gray whale, ended up off of Israel because it went through the Arctic. There was a paper on this recently. There are plankton now that seem to have moved through the Arctic that weren't. Just exploring, getting into that is a great story that hasn't really been explored. And it spilled us into management. I'm going to give you one quick example from the terrestrial end. In the Everglades in 2007, I did a big piece for the Times when I was still on staff about pythons. From the Burmese, South Asian pythons are just like loving the Everglades. They'll probably be in New Orleans in 100 years. And what's happened with fisheries and wildlife management, park officers, they have to spend all their time on invasive or overabundant species instead of on rare and species and managing park systems. It's actually become a really big burden on the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Park Service to deal with this new reality. And those stories are not yet told really adequately, I think.
Yeah, I think further on the ocean thing, which is, what's happening right now with the weather in Washington, D.C., it's colder here than it is in Alaska. And there's this situation that the question is I think it's an interesting research question. I don't think the answers are there by any means, but what role does the loss of Arctic ice cap have on the change in the behavior of the jet stream? When you look at what's happening in North America now, a couple of years ago, there was a similar situation over Europe when Greenland was at record warm. There was one of these blocking waves a few years ago when you had extreme drought and fires in Russia, and you had floods in Pakistan. There's a repeating behavior that we're seeing, and that's one of the unknown questions. Is this a result of the loss of Arctic ice?
Yes. How about in the back again? The gentleman in the last row with the blue jacket on and a tie.
Thank you very much for terrific discussion. My name is Shinichi Isobe with CSIS. I would like to have a comments about crude oil export, which is getting hot these days in Washington, D.C. What's going to be the core issue in this debate? Is it going to be the environmental issue or domestic gasoline price or energy security? And also, I'd like to have a comments about any kind of legislation or executive order can we expect within this year, or the real debate is after the midterm election? Thank you very much.
Do that one.
Anybody want?
I think it's going to be a big debate. I think it's going to be a long time before we actually see the final decisions on the major decisions on exporting crude oil. Probably won't go through Congress. They'll go through the Commerce Department. But I think this year we'll just see the opening up of the debate. And you asked what's going to be the core of the debate, and you touched on all the issues. It's going to be, it's going to be environmental questions. It's going to be gasoline prices. If gasoline prices go up, that's going to be what inflames this debate. But I think the debate is off and running. The oil companies have called for it. Lisa Murkowski has called for it. Center for American Progress and Ed Markey and Senator Menendez have come down hard against it. So I think they have opened up. What's interesting is that this debate this issue hasn't even been open for debate for 30 years. So just the fact that it's opening up, just the fact that a senator can get up and give a speech at Brookings and talk about this and have this sort of be a centerpiece issue is something new. So, but I think it will be a few years at least before. So I don't think we would see concrete action this year. Definitely not before midterms.
There's a follow-up question actually from the overflow room about what the likelihood of comprehensive tax reform, particularly with regard to energy policy. Will we see anything in 2014? And I'm wondering, to what extent could you use tax reform to get to an energy policy? If you guys see that being part of a debate in an election year.
If there were tax,
Let's put it to a vote.
If there eventually, if there were tax reform, that's where climate policy happens. Eventually, it would be nice if I were still covering this issue when this ever, when this ever happens. But I mean, the thinking is that in the long run, if there really is comprehensive tax reform, then there is a deal to be done that would absolutely have to be brought forward by a Republican fiscal conservative who would endorse a tax on carbon in exchange for a cut in taxes in either corporate or income tax. And that would be sort of a grand bargain deal that would be part of comprehensive tax reform. And that would be, that would be fundamental. That would be the biggest thing the U.S. could ever do on climate policy. Will it happen this year? No way.
So we save that for the 2025 year ahead?
Yeah.
All right, another question. Anybody? How about the blue sweater right in the middle?
Hi. I am wondering if you guys see anything on the horizon in terms of an environmental movement, revolution, popular uprising sort of thing, and in addition, whether that might be necessary to get our progress on track with what the environmental science is saying about the timescale with which we need to change.
I think you do have, although I sort of said it was imperfect, I think you do have the beginnings of much more activity or much more sense of a movement around Keystone. They have mobilized a lot of people. Is it enough? No. But you do see you do see much more popular organization than you would have sort of 3 years ago or 4 years ago, when it seemed like the major voices of the environmental movements were big professional environmental organizations that weren't sort of cadre-based organizations, that didn't have sort of as many grassroots activists. And now it seems to me, maybe because I look out for them, but that there are a lot of different movements happening on the ground, and a lot of them are involved with oil and gas issues, So you do see a lot of stuff happening on the ground in Texas, even in Pennsylvania, organizing around against fracking and against the Keystone Pipeline. And again, you see other people sort of on different issues to do with wilderness issues or the Arctic. And I think, it's hard to quantify what effect these groups have, and it would be easy to dismiss them and say no one listens to you. But I think at the same time you are seeing a recognition among the big environmental groups that they have to sort of take these voices along. A lot, and they have. If you look at the positions taken by the big environmental groups on things such as fracking, you have seen a shift that was in how they view natural gas drilling, and that has been because of the developing science and the sort of emerging evidence about the downsides of fracking in terms of methane emissions, in terms of potential threats to air and water quality. But I would argue that it also has to do with this exposure that's being done by a lot of individual activists.
One thing also, the divestment movement on campuses obviously has built a lot of steam and spilled into other arenas a little bit. I don't think it's going to change anything in a big way in terms of those investments don't really matter in terms of how things work. But what I love about it, and I think I've alluded to this at least one time, is it's part of a bigger discussion related to the different models of growth out there. Anytime you get a campus talking about our endowment, that's, if you just expand that to the global level, our endowment includes the environment, the climate system. So any reframing for the trustees of a university about what they think of, what their definition of fiduciary responsibility, is that just to maximize the profit on that nugget of money, or does it have another layer? I think is invaluable.
I also think you see a lot more movement of people make products. Companies that make products are listening to the moms that blog and tweet.
And employees.
And their employees, okay. Yeah, and it's they're responding. They may say, you know, they could argue all kinds of scientific stuff, but it's easier and it maintains the trust and the way that people perceive their product, and that's extremely valuable to them.
For example, Cheerios, right? I mean, Cheerios has sort of made this pledge to sort of get rid of GMOs, and just because they're trying to hold on to their market share and that they think they can do that with, you know, by sort of guaranteeing that they're not using any genetically modified products in that cereal.
But of course that was pandering, because oats are not, there's no GMO oats.
Sure, but they feel that the need to say that. They feel the need to be responsive, and I think there's an issue now about grape nuts, but you know.
Oh, GM?
Say that. I do think that, you know, looking at, I mean, there's certainly more attention being paid to various issues, chemicals and products, fracking and so forth, and there's more of the public becoming involved in these issues. But I think looking at the time scale and of climate change and other big issues, and also the indirect effects, long-term effects of things like chemicals and products. Okay, you have BPA, it has an effect, but it's not obviously immediate. It's not, you know, poison that's going to, you know, make you sick or kill you. So the very long-term effects of a lot of these things mitigate against having, as you said, mass, you know, popular movement in this area. I think a lot of people are focused, obviously, on the economy, on jobs and so forth, and the environment to a degree. But, you know, in China, you have, you know, there have been certain, in Beijing and other places, big cities, there have been days where, you know, the smog pollution has just been, you know, way beyond what's considered healthy limits, and, you know, people can see it. You know, you have the thick smog in the air, but that you can see. But I think a lot of places, you know, in the West, in the U.S. and elsewhere, you don't have that visible, immediate impact in terms of environmental degradation. You have pockets of it, but not broad instances of it. So I think in terms of mass movements, people need to be stimulated somehow. And people who have young kids, obviously you want to have healthy kids, so they're interested in chemicals and products. But for the general population, I think it's much more difficult to get them, you know, up out of their seats and thinking about the environment as opposed to their day-to-day responsibilities.
Just one quick note on that. I think if there's going to be significant policy change, particularly on climate, it's not going to come as the result of an environmental movement from the left. It's going to come as a result of conservative Republicans and corporations on the right. It's going to come when, you know, a conservative Republican is comfortable saying this is an economic issue. You know, this is something that we can talk about in the tax committee, and I'm not going to get killed, you know, in my reelect. I think when it becomes, I think when you have a conservative Republican who has a lot of constituents whose mayors say, well, you know, all of our insurance rates are going up, or we keep getting flooding, or something's changing, or we have droughts, or, you know, this is hurting our local businesses, and we're interested in this. I think that the change comes more when there's a recognition that this is something that's hurting bottom lines now, and it's sort of embraced as this is something that can be a conservative fiscal issue and gets a champion. Like, I think that's the thing that really broaches change, and if a number of not outliers like Bob Inglis, but someone from the conservative establishment is comfortable championing this. I think that's what triggers a change.
So the question would be, I mean, the fact, if this is an issue then that is embraced by people on the left, would you argue then that makes them less comfortable with embracing it? Because yeah.
I mean, I think in some ways, I think that, you know, I look at the protests around the Keystone Pipeline as something that, I mean, they've raised a lot. They've sort of galvanized fundraisers, but it's also by intensely politicizing this issue, I think it's become, you know, highly politicized, more ideological. I think it's become harder for a lot of moderate Republicans who used to be comfortable talking in this space to now come forward and talk about it. You know, people like Fred Upton, chair of the House Energy Committee, who a few years ago was, you know, had on his website, you know, that he thought climate change was a problem, talked about how climate change hurt Lake Michigan, sponsored the light bulb efficiency bill, and then, got attacked for all of that from the right. Those didn't used to be inflammatory issues, and now they are. So I would argue that as the issue gets extremely politicized, it makes it harder for moderate Republicans to just enter that conversation.
It's been said that the benefits of all the status quo are immediate and acute, but the costs are diffuse and intergenerational, and it's pretty tough to rally around the diffuse and intergenerational.
Sure is. I believe we have time for one last question. Let's take it in the sweater in the back. Did you second to last row?
Hi. Where's the journalistic leadership on those exciting issues of energy efficiency and the national energy grid?
In 2005 and 2006, we did a 2-year series called The Energy Challenge that was all about all that stuff at the Times. And it's hard to sustain that because some top leadership at papers thinks it's wonky. And some of it is, unfortunately. Kilowatt hours are different than kilowatts, that kind of thing. And so it's really hard. But we were able to do it at the Times for a number of years. Before, during, and after, there was a green desk.
In 2009, we put on the cover of National Geographic a story on energy conservation and efficiency. In 2007, we published the Sokolov stabilization wedge graph. We do try, but sometimes they don't get great amounts of response.
We do sort of running stuff, sort of whatever. We do running stuff. That really gets into the minutiae of stuff, even that people can do. We have numerous things, people talking diaries of people greening their homes, people putting in solar. Which is the most efficient way to make a cup of tea? Is it microwaving it, boiling, an electric kettle, or it's the electric kettle? Don't put it on the do it on the stovetop, and all different kinds of thing there. So we look at this in a multitude of different ways. For us, we found that the big picture thing hasn't worked because of the factors that Andy talked about. But little by little, we do look at those issues in a green living kind of way.
Yeah, I have a colleague who covers this issue, and it's always a fight to get some space on this, but it is essential.
And in defense of the press, everyone here, there's this constant tension between the environmental community and the media. Those media, if they only did this every day, if they had climate change on the front page every day, then we would decarbonize. And it's not that simple. And the deficit model on information, that many scientists have this expectation, well, this IPCC report will do it. After 25 years writing on climate change, I was convinced the deficit, I was putting out, figuring that people would want to read stuff and then maybe they'd do something. And then I got a hold of all the social and behavioral science literature, which talks about how people do or don't make decisions, and how they receive or reject information. And that's one thing that led me out of journalism. Not that it's not important.
But at the same token, when Google paid $3 billion for Nest, I have never seen so much coverage of a thermostat maker.
Yeah, right.
Right? And I think as you see some of these kind of, as home appliances become much more, kind of gee whiz and becomes much more of a part of the tech sector, and you see that merging of design and technology and working with your smartphone, suddenly I think you're going to see the story is going to kind of diversify out of the environment beat and into the tech beat, into the business beat, into economics to some extent. So, but thank you all for a fun discussion. I would like to say we just covered little snapshots here. If you really are excited about more information about this, I would highly recommend you check out SEJ's New Orleans conference at the end of the summer. It's right after Labor Day in New Orleans. We'll have plenty of discussion about this. There are some pamphlets outside, a lot of material out there. Pick up some Mardi Gras beads. And we'll get you plenty more. Thanks also, again, our reception. All of you, please stay for the reception. You can corner us. We can talk more about this. And thanks again to our sponsors at Bloomberg BNA, the International Reporting Project, the Environmental Law Institute, the American University School of Communication, and of course, the Wilson Center's Science and Technology Innovation Program and the Canada Institute. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for the Wilson Center.
Thank you, too.
Thank you.
Thanks, Larry.